Good afternoon. Um, we were doing this review, and we'll be finishing the review today. And I have some relatively brief remarks, uh, and that will conclude the course. I can announce now that you'll be getting your exam instead of a class on Wednesday at 12:30 when the class is scheduled. I will be sending you an email version of the final exam. And the final exam will consist of two parts. Each part will have three questions, and you just answer one question in each part. So really, the exam there should be two answers, and you will be able to submit the exam to the sort of Learn site, and the deadline is 6 o'clock on the 23rd of January. Are there any questions about this? So that's the setup, and then you need also you submit the exam to the online site of this course. Under assignments, there is a final exam. That's where you upload the paper. And likewise, there's a place there as well for the paper, for the term paper, which is due on the 19th. Any questions about that? And if you need some sort of special arrangement, just send me an email. Okay, so today I want to finish the last three questions and make some concluding remarks. I think we left off. We were on question 25. Why did it prove impossible to maintain the neutrality of Laos? Well, we saw that Laos, a small country, 3 million people, landlocked, sort of geographically located on the border of China, North and South Vietnam, Cambodia, that it was governed by this royal monarchy like the other states of Indochina under the French, that it achieves its independence shortly before the Geneva Conference. It was declared neutral by the Geneva Conference, and there were two attempts made to affirm its neutrality by the formation of coalitions between the contending parties in Laos. There was the first coalition between 1954 and 1957, and there was a second coalition government between 1962 and 1966. The neutrals, Suvarnabhumi, was the head of both of these governments, but in the first case, in the first coalition, it broke down because the Pathet Lao, the communist side, in the elections of 1957, won 2/3 of the seats in the parliament, and the right-wing leader, Pumi Nosavan, would not accept this and staged a coup d'etat. And so war broke out. And then again, in 1962, the war was continuing, and the Royal Laotian Army, the right-wing military force, was seriously defeated by the Pathet Lao in 1962. The Pathet Lao threatened to overrun the country. At this point, the Americans threatened intervention, but they settled for the formation of a second coalition headed by Pumi Nosavan. The problem in terms of Laotian neutrality was that on the one hand, the Royal Laotian government, both politically and military, was weak. The Pathet Lao were far stronger, and so that plus the intensification of the war in Vietnam, especially as the Vietnamese began to build the Ho Chi Minh Trail, meant that the royal government was extremely weak. The only force that it really was able to fight were the Hmong, or part of the Hmong mercenary group in eastern Laos along the North Vietnamese border. And so the Americans were basically forced to exercise as much influence as they could. So they used American money to buy a lot of political influence amongst the right wing, but also even the neutralists were under American influence. There were American missionaries quite active, CIA people. There were Thai mercenaries that the Americans brought in to help the Royal Laotian Army. But at the end of the day, the Americans used massive bombing of central and eastern Laos as a way of keeping the Pathet Lao from winning. So on the one hand, you have the political and military strength of the Pathet Lao, backed up by the North Vietnamese, undermining a neutral posture, and then you have the overwhelming influence of the United States on the other hand. And you might add something about this the debacle of 1971, the Lam Son 719 invasion of Laos by the South Vietnamese army. So that would be the answer. Any questions? So the next question, what were the consequences of the American war in Vietnam? The American war meaning the whole period of the American invasion, and then when they eventually withdrew their ground forces, they were still in evidence supporting General Tu until the collapse of the regime in 1975. So what was the effect of all this on Vietnam? Well, we could say, of course, what we have to say, the casualties, maybe as high as 4 million people, Vietnamese died, enormous numbers of people wounded, the physical destruction of the country, the infrastructure, certainly in the north, was leveled. The deforestation, the use of Agent Orange, which deforested, but also it caused cancer. All of this was incredibly devastating. But So this was the price. On the other hand, of course, the the DRV and the PAVN defeated the United States of America. This is the greatest military power on earth was forced to leave, and it this victory in itself has enormous sort of political meaning in terms of obviously the national ideology of the Vietnamese, the fact that they were able to defeat not only the French but this American giant in terms of the national psyche. Uh, you could imagine it gives the Vietnamese a certain confidence, which has become, of course, part of their national ideology. So it's very important in and of itself. And then they reaffirmed that by beating off the Chinese in the brief military conflict of 1978. So the affirmation of national independence, which, as I made a point of, this was so important in terms of what the Vietnamese had been fighting for throughout the whole of the 20th century. That was extremely important. And so we could say that also the sort of the as a result of the war, of course, this meant that feudalism, not only imperialism had been defeated, but also the landlord class no longer existed over the peasantry. And so there were the negative aspects of the war, but the positives are overwhelmingly important. And I would say that just to sort of round this off, that in terms of the history of Vietnam since 1975, well, there were some ups and downs, but I would say that getting rid of the landlords and getting rid of imperialism made it possible to create a national economy. The Vietnamese, of course, with a very strong central government, were able to sort of, on the one hand, create an increasingly productive peasant-based agriculture. Basically, we have private farming in Vietnam, but also an industrial sector, strong industrial sector. The more so as there has been an influx of foreign investment into Vietnam since the war, Japanese investment, Asian investment, and even American investment, because from the 90s onwards, the United States recognized the DRV, and some of its capitalists began to invest in the Vietnamese economy. And so I would say that Vietnam has basically created an economy similar to that of China, in which the state and the party directs the overall development. There are a lot of state-owned firms, but there's also a lot of private business in Vietnam as well. It rides I can put it this way, it rides the tiger of world capitalism, and sort of domesticates it by using the state as a way of controlling the overall development of the economy. So that would be the sort of the overall answer to that question. Finally, the last question to consider, because 28 recapitulates, it's the same as 23, so we don't refer to that. What impelled the Khmer Rouge massacre of its own population? Well, it's estimated between 1 and 2 million people died in the brief period of Khmer Rouge rule. But and in the first place, could say that this this killing off of so many people, the background to this is the split between the city and the countryside, and the hatred that developed amongst the peasants for Phnom Penh and the city, where this was where the usurers, this is where the people who were exploiting the countryside lived, and basically were regarded as parasites on the work of the common rural people. It's this tension, which particularly sort of stimulated by Khmer Rouge propaganda. The young and not very well educated Cambodian peasants were very hard on the city dwellers. And as I explained, there were dissidents, opponents, followers of Lon Nol who were outright killed. But it is essentially the urban population which suffered under the rule of the Khmer Rouge, and they were the principal victims in this massacre. But in addition to that, this is the main factor, but also explaining the massacre is the consequences of these years of war between 1970 and 78. There was the tremendous bombing of the United States right through this period to the last days of the war. Until 1975, and a kind of paranoia about the idea that the Americans would resume bombing, led the Khmer Rouge to order the evacuation of the capital, driving the population into the countryside where they became victims. It could also be said that there were economic difficulties, health difficulties, and finally that the Khmer Rouge wanted to control. They knew that the urban population was against them, and so driving them into the countryside was a way of gaining control of them. So all of those factors, I think, played a role. So I think with that, I have more or less finished the review. Are there any questions about these review questions? No, there's no. There are no questions. So I'm just going to conclude with several remarks. I would say one thing I would say is that I think the fact that the Vietnamese, the DRV was successful in this war, which was a vindication, I think, of sort of Maoist, sort of General Jap doctrines of protracted people's war, where guerrilla wars is the basic characteristic at the beginning, and it turns into a full-scale war where the enemy is defeated right on the battlefield. That this victory certainly is to the credit of the Vietnamese. There's no doubt about it. It's an extraordinary victory, but the Americans themselves have recognized that when they honored General Giap years later in Washington. But I think that we must also consider the fact that Vietnam was immediately contiguous to China, and close to the Soviet Union. And it seems to me it would have been very difficult for that really facilitated the Vietnamese victory. The fact that they were so close to their friends, the giant friends, who gave them a lot of help. And we can sort of contrast that with the fact that there have been many other national liberation struggles in the third world, which have not been so successful. And I do believe that from a geostrategic point of view, this is the geography of this conflict does explain the Vietnamese success, or helps to explain the Vietnamese success. That's one point I want to make. I guess the last point has to do with the future of American power. Now, I spoke of this conflict as a signal crisis for the United States. That is to say, as we saw, it really developed quite unexpectedly from the point of view of the Washington elites into a general crisis of American society, with these internal revolts, these millions of people protesting. And at the very central to this, of course, was the Black Revolt, which turned into when I say Black, it's the beginning of the Latino protest in the United States, of the indigenous protests, of the women's liberation movement, ultimately the gay liberation movement. They all emerged out of this. So there was a generalized protest and so that was one aspect of it, but also there was the economic crisis. The Americans had already begun to run a balance of trade problem prior to Vietnam, but it turned into a balance, not merely a question of exporting too little to the rest of the world and buying too much, but indeed a balance of payments problem. The loss of too much real money to foreign competitors of the United States. This was, and the devaluation of the dollar was a serious question. And the Americans never really addressed these questions. What they did was they made this deal with China. And I'm talking about the Nixon deal. And they exported a lot of their industries to China, which was, in retrospect, a complete folly, very short term. They didn't really rebuild the American economy, and they allowed the problem of social inequality actually to get worse and worse. So it truly was a signal crisis in that it forecasts what we have today, where I think that the question of internal decay, even political decay, has become really, really serious. And the accession of China is real. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, we're getting close to the end, but so the Chinese influence in Latin America has been growing in these last years in a very dramatic way. Chinese investment all over Latin America is very visible. So the Latin Americans, who until recent times were virtually entirely dependent on the United States, many countries, even countries with conservative politics, have been turning to China as a kind of alternative. So what I'm saying is that the American grip on its backyard, namely namely Latin America, has been slipping. And one of the most interesting aspects of this is the growing relationship between China and Cuba, which you'll remember, Cuba was, remember the whole question of revolt in the third world and counterinsurgency, how the Kennedy is starting with the Kennedy administration, the idea of countering third world revolutions, socialist revolutions, so on. Well, Cuba was the catalyst for all of this, the Cuban Revolution. Well, Cuba has been blockaded for many, many years, and despite the blockade, it has developed a very sophisticated educational system, a very sophisticated sort of infrastructure has been put into place. But from an economic point of view, Cuba, especially from the point of view of meeting the ordinary needs of the population in terms of things like housing and consumer goods, the Cuban economy has lagged behind, and the economic blockade has been the main reason. Well, now what we're seeing, faced with the fact that the Americans are now reblockading China, and especially insisting on sort of the independence of Taiwan, the Chinese are suddenly taking a great interest in Cuba. And right offshore from the United States, they are beginning to make serious investments in the Cuban economy, in putting into place a really modern infrastructure in Cuba, helping to do that, and also opening up increasing trading relationships with Cuba, thereby undermining the American economic blockade. And therefore, I said it's difficult to see how the United States can sort of stop these processes in the same way as the Chinese are using the trillions of dollars of spare cash that they've accumulated in sort of opening up the Silk Road across Eurasia, getting around the American naval blockade in the Pacific. So I guess I'm saying that we are, and especially this is all going on in the midst of the pandemic, of course, which itself represents a sort of a turning point, in my view, in world history. The world really is changing. The world really is changing. We are witnessing a very serious change. The Germans use a word called Zeitgeist, or spirit of the times. And you can feel, I think maybe even you could feel it psychologically, that the times really are changing. The Zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, is really changing. We're witnessing what's called serious historic change. And it all started in Vietnam. And so with that, I appreciate your attention to this course, and I wish you success on the final exam and with your essay. And please, any questions or reactions, queries, simply get in touch with me. So with that, I wish you an end to this wretched pandemic. Thank you very much.